right. Now, South Africa is heading towards a day of reckoning, at least according to Meizlish, a senior analyst at the Center on Economic and Financial Power and a former advisor at the U.S. Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control. In a recent column for the Wall Street Journal, Meizlish warned that global markets are dangerously underestimating South Africa's growing sanctions and compliance risks. Now, especially, of course, looking at the issues that are currently happening in the country. Max joins us now on the line. Max, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Max, you recently wrote that a day of reckoning is coming for South Africa. Can you briefly summarize what led to your this conclusion?
Yeah, of course. As part of my work here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in our Center on Economic and Financial Power, I'm looking at threats to U.S. interests and allied interests. And over the last several months, for about a year now, we've been looking at South Africa as a jurisdiction of increased risk from a sanctions perspective and compliance. And what we see is that since the beginning of the Trump presidency, more aggressive actions have been taken by the United States against South Africa. And in part, that's because of choices taken by South Africa, and in particular by leaders of the ANC that are more malign in nature and bringing South Africa more in partnership with certain adversaries of the United States, such as China, Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxies.
Yeah. You also say that the Wall Street is mispricing South Africa's risks. What exactly is being overlooked by markets and financial institutions, in your view?
So normally what we want to see is when governments are growing closer to adversaries of the West, that the markets are going to react more negatively to that. And that's separate from the fact that there's been all of these aggressive actions taken from the Trump administration. So it's worrying in my eye that markets aren't necessarily reacting in as strong of a way as you might suspect. And perhaps that's because the risk isn't being seen for what it actually is. And so as I lay out in the piece, which I recommend your listeners go check out, the Wall Street Journal, what we see is that over the last several months, actions have been taken by the Trump administration to increasingly isolate South Africa in a way that demonstrates South Africa is taking on more of a pariah-like status in Washington. And so that begins from February, when President Trump issued a sweeping executive order that suspended financial assistance towards South Africa. It then expelled the country's ambassador in March. There were recent reports that the special envoy who had been sent over to the United States was actually denied a visa. And then there's a signal that the administration may actually oppose the AGOA trade program, which has key benefits to certain sectors of the South African economy. So when you take all that together, you would expect to see more price risk or an understanding that there is greater risk in South Africa, and potentially people will open up to that reality.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're talking about the issues that has to do with politics and the geopolitical angle. I mean, South Africa's ambassador, expelled in America. How has South Africa's alignment with China, Russia, and Iran heightened its exposure to U.S. sanctions and financial isolation? And I'm asking because there's a general narrative out there that people suggest that because South Africa is a junior partner in the BRICS bloc, so it finds itself vulnerable to those attacks by the United States. How has this been a challenge for South Africa, this alignment?
Well, it seems to me that South Africa, and particularly driven by some interests within the ANC, are driving the country closer towards those countries, and as a matter of choice, and not necessarily out of necessity. I think that the reality is that South Africa can and should be a great partner to the United States, like the United States should be a great partner to South Africa. But the reality is that because of these growing alignments, in fact, South Africa moving away from its stated non-alignment posture and more into supporting China, Russia, Iran, and its proxies, this has invited attention in a negative way. And so what we saw from the February executive order, not only did President Trump have concerns about some of the land reform issues and expropriation laws in South Africa, but also in the executive order, they highlight how South Africa is taking meaningful steps to reinvigorate its relationship with Iran along civil, commercial, nuclear cooperation. So that's a big deal for it to be called out like that in an executive order. The administration also noted other foreign policy entanglements between South Africa and other adversaries of the United States. And this has drawn attention from members of Congress, including key members of Congress who sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in fact, your viewers, or your listeners might be interested in knowing that tomorrow the House Foreign Affairs Committee will be reviewing a piece of legislation referred to as the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. And in that bill, it calls for against the ANC and other government who are more malign in their foreign policy towards the United States.
Yeah. So we do know that South Africa is chairing the G20 presidency, and we've seen America increasingly skipping the G20 meetings. I mean, we just concluded the finance track in Sherpa Finance Track in Durban. But in your view, what signal did U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent skipping the G20 meetings, the Cape Town one and the Durban one? What does this send to the financial markets and investors? How is this putting South Africa? Is it a turning point? How is it sitting with South Africa in your view?
So in my assessment, what all these actions taken together suggest is that Washington is attempting to isolate Pretoria. And there's still time for action to be taken, positive action to be taken by the South Africans, and moving away from these more malign foreign policy stances that have been taken in relation to China, Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxies. But the reality is...
Sorry to cut in. Where do you think South Africa... How do you think South Africa should go about it? Because these are... They say that it's because they are a multilateral country, they can be friends with the BRICS bloc and friends with America at the same time. And how do you think South Africa can go about just abandoning the BRICS bloc and other friends and focusing on America alone?
Yeah. And so it's a good question, and there's a lot of ways in which countries can engage in trade and normal diplomatic relations with other countries, even countries that the United States doesn't have the best relationship with. But actions do have consequences, and when a country like South Africa willfully participates in military exercises with China or Russia, or has great investment in Iran's telecommunications sector through MTN Irancell, these are real concrete actions that a government is taking to support. And it would be through those types of actions that the U.S. is looking at South Africa and saying, okay, well, they're pushing away from the United States. So disassociating the South African government from that type of support would be a meaningful step in the right direction.
Yeah. And also there's been controversy around the appointment of Mcebisi Jonas as special envoy to the U.S. How has that, situation impacted the U.S.-South Africa diplomatic relations in practice? And I'm asking because we know that he's chairing, he's part of the MTN, and MTN was doing things with Iraq. So how has that put South Africa and America's in terms of diplomatic relations?
I think that the view in Washington for quite some time since the special envoy was announced as the representative coming over to represent the presidency was that he was the wrong man for the job. And after the expulsion of South Africa's ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, there was hope in Washington that South Africa would send someone who was focused more on addressing key concerns related to trade and talking in a meaningful way. But it's notable that given the fact that the president's February executive order talked about South Africa reinvigorating its relationship with Iran to include commercial and nuclear relations, the individual sent over is one of the key representatives of South Africa to a major venture in Iran. So I don't know if this is the government, not reading the signals right, or just getting it entirely wrong altogether. So it's really unclear. But the view from Washington is that he was the wrong man for this job, and I think that the fact that it demonstrates that.
Yeah, but the presidency tells us that he was at the center of preparing the meeting between him and Ramaphosa. But you also warn about possible sanctions on South Africa's banks and state-owned entities. What kind of triggers could bring, that about, in terms of the challenges that we're facing already?
Yeah, so as I put out in the piece, there's growing interest in Congress to sanction individual members of parliament or ANC officials that are responsible for some acts of corruption, human rights abuses, all things that I think a lot of South Africans would actually welcome to the extent that it relates to corruption in the country. But beyond that, there's significant sanctions exposure to the firms that are actually facilitating dealings between entities in South Africa and entities in, say, Russia and Iran, where there's exposure to Russia's financial services sector, to certain nefarious cryptocurrency exchanges, to the extent that there's investment in minerals and mining sectors. We saw that come out from the recent trade delegation that went to Russia. The top line news item was we want to double or triple trade in certain strategic sectors, including energy and financial services and mining. These are all the specific areas of the Russian economy that are heavily under U.S. sanctions and clearly invite sanctions for South African firms that are going to do that investment.
Max, you've said that the ANC is drifting towards authoritarian regimes, and this could expose the entire financial system. What are the reputational and financial consequences if this path continues? And one can say, hang on, that's not true because the ANC is in the government of national unity. Things starting to, the leaders are being called to account. Wouldn't you agree that perhaps the GNU brought a bit of light? And why do you suggest that the ANC is drifting towards that kind of regime?
My job is to be an analyst, and this is the path that I see unfolding before us, and it's been years in the making. But all of this is happening in plain sight, and frankly, what worries me is the extent to which there's activity that may be more nefarious that is happening under the radar. And there are concerns about the extent to which South Africa might be enabling shipment of weapons to Russia. That's very worrisome. And with respect to reputational risk, there's major financial institutions that are operating in South Africa, and this is a little bit in the weeds for your listeners, right? But the nature of how money moves across the world is that banks in South Africa have exposure through what are called correspondent accounts with firms in the United States, and that's how they can move dollars. And so when firms in the United States might begin to think that there's a greater risk profile in South Africa as it relates to adversaries of the West, they might selectively choose to not do as much business. And what could be even more significant is if U.S. sanctions prevent them from doing that in the first place.
Yeah. Finally, Max, what corrective steps, if any, can South African government take now to avoid isolation or further penalties?
So signal, and this doesn't eliminate all of these other risks as they relate to China, Russia, and Iran, but a major signal I think that this administration in the United States and members of Congress would see as a step in the right direction would be the government changing its posture towards Israel and the lawfare against Israel. But that, like I said, that doesn't discount these other threats, right? And so the extent to which there's a memorandum of understanding between South Africa and Russia or South Africa and China on areas of technological cooperation, of military cooperation. I mean, these are really things that the South African government needs to assess whether it's in the interest of South Africa to do and the nature of the consequence that they're inviting. So moving away from those types of actions and demonstrating to the United States that, in fact, South Africa wants to be a good and valuable partner to the United States and it's willing to take the actions in that direction, that would be what's most meaningful.
Yeah. 1st of August, tariffs are kicking in. Do you think there's still time to restore trust? Is there still hope to change things around?
You know, I wouldn't bet one way or another as to whether the tariffs will go into effect. I mean, what we've seen is that there have been delays, and so I really can't say one way or another. But I will say that meaningful action can lead to meaningful responses. And if the government wants to take a change of course and demonstrate in a really credible and meaningful way, I think the administration would be entirely open to that because, like I said at the top, the view in Washington is that South Africa can and should be a valuable partner and ally to the United States, but it's going to be up to the South African government to see if that happens.
All right, Max, thank you so much for making the time and sharing your insights.
Of course, thank you.
There you have it. That was Max Meizlish, senior researcher, analyst at the Center on Economic and Financial Power, sharing insights on South Africa's rising geopolitical and compliance risks and what are some of the things that we can expect ahead. That conversation brings us to exactly 21:48 Central African time.